we have a lot of welfare cliffs throughout our set of programs. So if you earn too much, you lose TANF, which is kind of formerly AFDC. It's basically cash welfare, although it's not much cash today. And that's going to make it so that you're actually not going to want to earn above a certain amount. Same thing happens with children's health insurance plan. So kind of we have a lot of, and actually in general, even without the cliffs, the poor face the highest marginal tax rates of anyone in the distribution because of these phase outs of benefits. I think we say that we have a very, and the charts we were showing earlier show we have a progressive tax code, but actually the marginal tax rates when you include taxes and transfers are so high because all of these programs phase out together throughout as you're getting out of poverty. So I think we make it really hard for people to escape poverty because of the design of the programs.
Yeah. So if you believe in hard work and also that man is motivated by incentives, what this seems to show is that as you make more money, you actually can get worse off because of these kind of the way these programs are structured. And so these things that a lot of people feel are so crucial, and they are, but the way that they're administered, they provide great disincentives to work. And I guess the optimal move is probably to be just left of that Medicaid limit for parents, because once you make a couple thousand more, then you lose all of that and you're way worse off. Is that the way to look at it?
Yeah, you sort of have to count on people either driving value from their work or hoping that they're going to earn more in the future to make it worthwhile, or not wanting to be on these programs, which it's often not a great thing to be on Medicaid compared to other health insurance. But still, people do respond to incentives. And we shouldn't blame them for acting that way. It's quite a rational thing, what you described.
Yeah, wouldn't it be great if they could work, get a job, get a better job, get another job, or work more hours and result in their family being better off next month versus falling off this cliff and being like, what the hell did I do? I put in more hours. I worked hard for this job, and now my kids are worse off. Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to the next one. Let's see. This one. Cash has less overhead than in-kind benefits.
Yeah. So in general, if you take programs like food stamps, housing vouchers, other kind of non-cash benefits, they're pretty expensive to administer. On average, they're about 10%. And these are the biggest federal programs that can benefit from most economies of scale. And compare that to something like the EITC, Earned Income Tax Credit, probably one of the biggest cash transfer programs we have. That's less than 1% administrative overhead. So that's more money that we can give directly to households for every dollar we put into the program. And if you think about not just this, but all the programs at the state level, at maybe the city or the county level that are very expensive to administer because they just, they only serve maybe a few thousand people, but they have to have someone on staff working on it. Having a UBI could relieve a lot of government agencies from, demanding that overhead.
That makes a ton of sense. I was just looking at the CARES Act, and I think they had set aside $300 million just for the salaries of the federal workers to administer the small business loans.
Wow. And they're not even doing it. It's the banks who are doing it.
Yeah, I don't know what it was amazing. And then there's also all the FAA money for the airlines. It was also all this earmarked money for the Federal Aeronautical Administration, increased staffing to deal with these stimuli programs. And so, it's not surprising that, and I would not be surprised if that administrative cost is even bigger than what these charts show, just because of just how wasteful and inefficient sometimes large organizations can be.
Exactly. And I think every time you see a high overhead cost, that's often associated not just with costs from the taxpayer side. It also means that, those people are doing investigation of people who are receiving the funds. That means the people receiving the funds are often having to engage even more with the government. So there's a ton of time costs. If you're poor, you have to dedicate hours per week sometimes to fulfilling the requirements and just doing paperwork and understanding it. And sometimes a lot of these people might not have the education to navigate it efficiently. So we're putting people through a lot of hurdles. We're putting the government through a lot of hurdles. We're putting the taxpayers through a lot of hurdles, fundamentally because of a lack of trust, which I think is unjustified. And UBI solves that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, anytime you have to interact with a government service, it's generally not a great experience. And so I mean, even just getting your driver's license renewed is just not a great experience. I would imagine some of these guys who have to deal with, SNAP or housing vouchers, like on top of the experience not being great, there's probably a sense of like, oh, they're checking up on me. They don't trust me. I'm not a good person. They're like watching over my shoulder. Like there's cost to that too. To your point, not just dealing with the government, but also maybe the stigma of having to do all this stuff. So yeah, it's clearly the bar chart all the way to the right it's like those nonprofits that you want to donate to, that where most of the money actually goes to the people versus like, the CEO of the nonprofit and their entourage. Let's move on to the next one.
Cool. So starting to get into territory where I've done some research. So this is an analysis I did showing if we replace the child tax credit with a child allowance. So right now the child tax credit in the US is up to $2,000 per child, but it phases in with income and it phases out with income as well. So it's one of these trapezoids that US policymakers love to implement. And I showed that really would have a major progressive impact. The bottom quartile would see their income go up over 10% if we did that, just often because I think we understate how impoverished those kinds of folks are. And having any kind of phase in of the income is going to really reduce the effect for them.
Yeah. So for those who are not as familiar, what you're saying is if you replace the child tax credit with a child allowance, and child allowance is like a cash payment of some sort, or is that how that works?
Yeah, it's basically UBI for kids.
Yeah. That the people on the lowest 25%, the lowest quartile of income, that would be quartile 1, would have a 10% change in terms of the resources available to them. And then what about the cost to the government? I mean, would it be similar or would it be more expensive to do the child?
So that would be more expensive because the green line is giving $2,000 to every child instead of the children who are currently eligible. But if you were cut it down to $1,500, that would be revenue neutral. And that would still be quite progressive without having a major negative effect on higher earning households. So $2,000, I think that would be maybe 20 billion or somewhere around there if we were to scale.
Not a huge amount. I mean, the gray line, if you want to be sort of more fiscally conservative, this one is like, look, government's not going to lose any money. Going to spend the same amount that we're already spending, but the bottom 25% of the country are going to be 7% better. And then the rest of the folks won't even notice. They're like barely, right?
Yep. And once it's universal, it's a lot easier to make it monthly. So other countries have monthly child allowances. Ireland and Sweden both have that. And they're truly universal. So I think that one of the challenges with having a means-tested monthly program is you have to figure out, am I going to claw it back later? Or am I going to make it based on income from a year ago, even though you're continuing to give payments almost 2 years later? So universality solves that.
Now, one of the things that some of my more conservative family and friends would say is like, look, any kind of incentive for people to have more children is suspect. That you remember, well, you probably won't, but back in the 80s, there was a Reagan kind of campaign around these welfare queens, and they would have all these babies just to get like drive around in Cadillacs and wear Rolexes and stuff. And I'm just curious, like, have you seen any research around child benefits and the impact on number of kids per family and the poverty level of that family?
Yeah, there is a small effect. I think if I remember right, it doesn't actually make people have their first child, but it could induce people to have their second or third child maybe earlier than they would have otherwise. But right now, we are actually in a situation where we risk becoming closer to Japan in terms of population. So if anything, this is the time, in my opinion, and I think a lot of population researchers, where we should expand this kind of child assistance, if for no other reason than to encourage more childbearing.
Yeah. So you raised the point about Japan having like so few young people and all these old people. So it's kind of like this inverted pyramid looking thing. What's your view on whether or not we need more and more workers? I mean, obviously, with Andrew's campaign, he was advocating that artificial intelligence and automation would replace a lot of today's jobs. Is your view that, well, that's fine, but 5 or 10 years from now, there'll be newer jobs, so the total employment kind of need for labor won't go down? Do you have a take on that?
I think so. I think it's possible that automation will reduce the number of jobs we have in the future. But right now, I'm not sure the evidence has borne that out too much. And this is an area I might disagree with some Yang Gang folks on. But if you consider what Japan has had as an issue, it's kind of what we're dealing with right now, where people need a lot of healthcare. And if you're an old folk in a hospital in Japan, you're basically relying on your family members to provide you help in that room, cooking meals, things like that, because they just don't have enough young people to work in the hospitals. And we're dealing that with pandemics. I think health is going to be a bigger part of the economy in the future. This is just going to jumpstart that. And the worst thing that happens is we have more kids. That's more humans who get to enjoy life on this planet. And we still have all the robots to take care of them, and they won't actually have to do any work in the future. I think I would be okay with that too.
Someone was asking in the chat a few minutes ago about, here we go, whether all of this like pro-human policy will result in overpopulation and pollution. Curious, do you have any thoughts on that?
It's possible, although so far we've seen in the US, for example, that we are actually producing less carbon emissions per capita. As more countries have the same kind of economic growth that we've had, that's going to continue to be the case. And actually, in the US, we're actually now using less material overall to produce all the goods that we rely on. So there's this concept, I think from MIT Economist as well, called dematerialization. And that's going to continue as well. At the same time, if you look at who's developing the clean technology that we need to reduce pollution, even do carbon capture, things like that, those are young, educated, bright people who are developing that kind of technology. We're going to need more of those in the future as well.
All right. Let's move on to the next one. This is about, hold on. Where were we? Here we go. This minor change would end extreme child poverty. All right. Extreme child poverty. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so this is the leftmost series of bars. This is basically representing the share of the population child population in poverty after taxes and transfers according to different thresholds. So if you take the extreme child poverty rate, that's basically $2 a day. Probably we don't have much of that. This might even exaggerate it based on survey issues. But supposing we have any of it, having a child allowance like what I mentioned on the previous slide would completely end extreme child poverty. So I think that, and we see also kind of a deterioration in the share of people or children in poverty, depending on the line, we're really reducing this situation, which is correlated with lower productivity as an adult, all these kind of issues later in life.
So is the crux of the child tax credit that if you're too poor to have any taxes to pay, then this tax credit, like, it doesn't do you any good? Is that the reason why the CTC is so much worse than the child benefit?
It's a good question. Yeah. So it's actually a mix of two programs, the child tax credit and the additional child tax credit. And the additional child tax credit is refundable. So even if you don't owe any taxes, you still get a benefit from it. But the child tax credit is not. And these are always bunched together, essentially. So if you don't pay any federal tax, there's kind of an upper bound lower than $2,000 that you get from it.
Got it. Makes perfect sense. Let's go to this one. Ooh, the freedom dividend. I've heard of this.
Yeah.
Let's see here. The freedom dividends taxes are progressive. Whoops. Let's go back here. So tell me about this one.
Yeah. So a common objection from people around the freedom dividend, as we talked about earlier, is that the taxes are regressive. And that is slightly true for the VAT. But if you look at Andrew's full proposal, the VAT is just one piece. It's about 2/3 of the revenue comes from the VAT. He also calls for a carbon tax, treating capital gains as ordinary income. And there's a couple other features that tend to be progressive. So if you put all of that together, we're looking at the tax rate as a share of income by income decile. It's roughly flat for the bottom 9 deciles, and then it goes up quite a bit for the topmost decile. So it is technically progressive. I think this is not the right way to evaluate a reform. You need to look at it in the whole. But if people are concerned about it, at least this diffuses one of the common objections.
Yeah. So as you get the richest 10% will pay more taxes than everyone else under the Yang plan.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So then some people will hopefully be a little bit more at ease. Maybe I think they would probably argue like, well, it's not progressive enough. It should be like 5 times as much as the bottom decile or something. But that's, at least it's not regressive.
Right.
So what's this one? But the full policy is much more progressive. Oh, talk about this one.
Yeah. So this is showing that, in my opinion, and from the research I've done, this would probably be the most progressive, most poverty reducing policy, maybe in US history. Maybe Social Security is close. But Social Security is kind of a regressive payment system as well. So the fact that this is a truly universal program paid to everyone makes it such that the net benefit after taxes and transfers for the bottom decile, the bottom 10%, is over 100%. We're over doubling their income.
Wow.
And this just continues to drop off until you reach the top decile, and they're losing more than they're getting from it. But as a share of income, it's like 3% of their income. That's
amazing. So if you're in the bottom 10% of America's wealth earners, you would have more than double the disposable income to you with the freedom dividend and Yang's plan. And if you care about truly poor people, then this should be like a mic drop moment, right? Like, but interestingly enough, now I don't want to steer too much into politics, but I do have to say, like, it is weird that even within the Democratic Party, there isn't like a warm embrace of basic income. I think it's getting better, but I'm curious, like within the academic world and the world of economists that are running the numbers, I'm sure you probably encounter skepticism around basic income at MIT as well, or is it more like, oh, everybody already gets it? It's just those rascals down in DC.